For thousands of years, India's rivers have not only watered its fertile lands, but also nourished its soul. Along their banks, empires rose and fell, temples were built, philosophies debated, and sacred texts composed. From the thunderous footsteps of Mauryan elephants to the intricate poetry of Mughal courts, dynasties used religion not just to connect with the divine, but to shape the very identity of a civilization. But how did power and piety intertwine so deeply? What made kings not only warriors, but custodians of culture and faith? Welcome to Words of Time, where history comes alive one story at a time. In this video, we'll take you on a journey through India's sacred past, exploring how dynasties from the Mauryas to the Mughals used religion and culture as powerful tools of empire. From Ashoka's edicts carved in stone to Akbar's dream of a unified spiritual order, we uncover the legacy of rulers who reshaped a subcontinent not just with swords, but with ideas, beliefs, and beauty. Let's dive in. India's history is deeply shaped by the geography of its sacred rivers, the philosophical richness of its spiritual traditions, and the rise and fall of powerful empires that left enduring imprints on its religion and culture. Among the most significant natural forces in this history are the Ganges, Yamuna, and Indus rivers. These waterways are not merely physical lifelines but sacred entities, woven into myth, ritual, and the very imagination of Indian civilization. They served as the cradle of early human settlements, supported flourishing kingdoms, and became symbols of purity, divinity, and continuity. The Ganges, often referred to as Ganga in Indian tradition, is perhaps the most sacred river in Hindu belief. Rising in the Himalayas and flowing eastward across the plains of northern India, the Ganges is revered as a goddess who descended to earth to purify human sins. The Yamuna, another vital river, runs parallel to the Ganges and features prominently in the legends of Krishna. The Indus, though now mostly in Pakistan, was the heartland of the ancient Indus Valley civilization. These rivers shaped more than agriculture and settlement patterns. They nurtured cultural memory, religious mythologies, and civilizational identities for over 3,000 years. Long before written texts and established kingdoms, India's spiritual roots were embedded in prehistoric belief systems that worshipped natural forces. Archaeological remains from sites like Mehrgarh and Harappa suggest that early inhabitants practiced animism, ancestor worship, and fertility cults. Over time, these beliefs evolved into more complex religious systems with the advent of the Vedic tradition around 1500 BCE. The Vedas, composed in Sanskrit, laid the foundations of Hinduism. They contained hymns, rituals, and philosophical inquiries that gradually gave rise to concepts like dharma, moral order, karma, action and consequence, and moksha, liberation. The Rig Veda, the oldest of the four Vedas, portrays a society deeply connected to nature, fire, water, wind, and sky. Fire rituals, yajnas, and chanting became the cornerstone of early religious practice, facilitated by priests known as Brahmins. This spiritual framework not only explained the cosmos, but also legitimized social order through the Varna system, which later hardened into caste divisions. Religion in this era was both personal and political, laying the ground for its future manipulation by rulers and empires. As dynasties began to rise in the Indian subcontinent, they recognized the power of religion not just as a spiritual necessity, but as a tool of statecraft. The early Maurya Empire, under Chandragupta Maurya in the 4th century BCE, established one of the first large-scale centralized governments in Indian history. His grandson Ashoka stands as a prime example of how religion could be harnessed to solidify power and spread ideology. After the bloody Kalinga War, Ashoka embraced Buddhism and promoted it through rock edicts, inscriptions, and missionary efforts both within and beyond India. His transformation of Buddhism from a regional sect to a Pan-Asian movement demonstrates how religion could serve both personal conviction and imperial vision. Subsequent dynasties followed suit. The Guptas in the 4th and 5th centuries CE revived Brahmanical Hinduism, patronizing Sanskrit literature, temple construction, and rituals that celebrated divine kingship. They cast their rule as divinely sanctioned, with kings portrayed as earthly representatives of gods like Vishnu. Temples were not just places of worship, but symbols of state power and cultural prestige. Architecture, sculpture, and ritual performance all played roles in reinforcing dynastic legitimacy. Religion also provided a unifying force in a culturally and linguistically diverse landscape. Through shared myths, festivals, and pilgrimage routes, empires could create a sense of collective identity across regions. The sacred river Ganga became not just a spiritual metaphor, but also a territorial spine for kingdoms like the Mauryas and Guptas. By aligning themselves with the spiritual sanctity of such rivers, rulers claimed moral authority as well as military might. Over centuries, as new religions like Jainism, Buddhism, and later Islam entered the Indian subcontinent, the use of religion by political power became more complex and pluralistic. Emperors often patronized multiple faiths to maintain harmony and assert a universal kingship. Akbar of the Mughal Empire, for instance, famously invited religious scholars from Hindu, Jain, Christian, and Muslim backgrounds to his court and experimented with a syncretic philosophy known as Din-i-Ilahi. While short-lived, this initiative reflected the long-standing Indian tradition of drawing strength from diversity. However, religion was not always used benignly. Dynasties also weaponized it to suppress dissent, justify wars, or enforce orthodoxy. Temples and mosques were frequently targets during conflicts, not just for their spiritual significance, but because they symbolized state authority and wealth. Religious policies could be inclusive or exclusionary, depending on the ruler's outlook and political needs. Despite these shifts, a common thread ran through all dynasties from the Mauryas to the Mughals, a deep recognition of religion's role in shaping society. Whether through the Buddhist Dhamma of Ashoka, the Hindu Dharma of the Guptas, or the Islamic jurisprudence of the Delhi Sultanate and Mughal courts, religion was never merely a private affair. It was embedded in governance, law, education, and daily life. The state and the sacred were intertwined in ways that few other civilizations witnessed with such continuity and diversity. Moreover, dynasties were not passive patrons but active architects of culture. They funded monasteries, built universities like Nalanda and Vikramashala, commissioned epics and philosophical treatises, and fostered artistic traditions that merged the spiritual with the aesthetic. The cultural legacy they left behind from cave temples in Ajanta to the Taj Mahal stands as testimony to how empire and faith shaped one another. India's sacred rivers did more than nourish its land, they irrigated its spiritual consciousness and inspired empires to rise in their name. The interplay between geography, belief, and power created a unique civilizational rhythm. The dynasties that ruled over this landscape recognized that to control India, one had to also command its sacred imagination. Through religion, they found the language to unite people, assert authority, and leave a legacy that continues to shape Indian identity even today. The Maurya Empire stands as one of the most transformative and foundational periods in Indian history. Emerging in the late 4th century before the Common Era, it was the first empire to unify the vast and diverse subcontinent under a single centralized administration. The Mauryas did not merely establish political dominance, they reshaped the very fabric of Indian society by fusing governance with ethical philosophy, creating an imperial vision rooted in order, justice, and dharma. At the heart of this transformation was Chandragupta Maurya, the founder of the empire. He rose to power during a period of great political instability, marked by the disintegration of smaller kingdoms and the retreat of Alexander the Great's forces from northwestern India. With the counsel and strategic guidance of his minister and mentor Chanakya, also known as Kautilya, Chandragupta overthrew the Nanda dynasty and established his capital at Pataliputra. This marked the beginning of a centralized state with a sophisticated bureaucratic apparatus. Kautilya's treatise, the Arthashastra, laid the groundwork for governance, espionage, taxation, and diplomacy, illustrating a pragmatic and sometimes ruthless approach to statecraft. The Maurya administration was highly organized, with a well-defined hierarchy of officials, detailed record-keeping, and regional governance designed to ensure loyalty to the center. Chandragupta's rule extended across northern India, reaching as far west as present-day Afghanistan. His diplomatic treaty with Seleucus Nicator, a successor of Alexander, was not just a military victory but a political masterstroke. Through marriage alliances and the exchange of ambassadors, the Mauryas engaged with Hellenistic powers while consolidating their eastern dominion. Chandragupta's later years were marked by a spiritual transformation. According to Jain tradition, he abdicated the throne, embraced Jainism, and retired to Karnataka, where he spent his final days in meditation and austerity. Whether or not all details of this account are historically verifiable, they reflect a larger theme in Indian political culture: the intertwining of power and renunciation. Chandragupta was succeeded by his son Bindusara, who continued his father's policy of expansion and consolidation. Bindusara extended the empire deeper into the Deccan Plateau, maintaining order and revenue flow through a complex network of provincial governors and military outposts. While his reign is less documented than his predecessor or his son Ashoka, Bindusara's role in maintaining imperial cohesion was crucial. His court was open to diverse influences, including the presence of Greek ambassadors like Dimachus, pointing to the cosmopolitan nature of the Mauryan administration. Bindusara also upheld the Mauryan tradition of religious tolerance, allowing multiple sects to coexist under imperial patronage. The most celebrated figure of the Mauryan dynasty, however, is Ashoka. His reign marked a turning point not just for the empire, but for Indian political thought. Ashoka inherited a vast but volatile empire and initially pursued a policy of aggressive expansion. His most infamous campaign was the conquest of Kalinga, a region located on the eastern coast of India. The war was devastating, resulting in the death and displacement of hundreds of thousands. The scale of human suffering in Kalinga deeply affected Ashoka, triggering a moral and philosophical crisis that led him to embrace Buddhism. Ashoka's conversion was not a private transformation, but a public turning point in imperial ideology. He began to rule not through fear and conquest, but through the principles of dharma, righteousness, compassion, and justice. His edicts, inscribed on rocks and pillars across the empire in various local languages and scripts, serve as one of the earliest examples of a ruler communicating ethical policies directly to his people. These edicts did not promote Buddhism in a sectarian sense, but advocated for universal moral values such as respect for all life, religious tolerance, nonviolence, obedience to elders, and ethical governance. Ashoka's use of edicts as a communication tool was revolutionary. Instead of relying solely on proclamations through royal courts or religious institutions, he addressed common people directly. These inscriptions, some still visible today in locations like Sarnath, Dhali, and Girnar, emphasized his commitment to moral transformation over territorial expansion. Ashoka appointed officials known as Dharma Mahamatras to oversee the implementation of ethical principles and ensure fair treatment of all subjects, including prisoners, women, and foreigners. While Ashoka did not formally declare Buddhism as the state religion, he gave it unprecedented patronage. Monasteries received imperial grants, stupas were erected across the empire, and missions were sent abroad to propagate the Buddha's teachings. Perhaps the most significant of these missions was led by his son Mahinda and daughter Sanghamitta to Sri Lanka, where Buddhism took firm root and continues to thrive. Ashoka also hosted the Third Buddhist Council at Pataliputra, which aimed to purify the monastic community and systematize the doctrine. In this way, he institutionalized Buddhism within an imperial framework without enforcing conversion, instead advocating for religious harmony. Mauryan architecture reflected this synthesis of political authority and religious ethics. Ashoka's reign saw the construction of monumental stupas, dome-shaped structures that housed relics of the Buddha and served as pilgrimage sites. The most famous of these is the Great Stupa at Sanchi, an architectural marvel that combines symbolic geometry with artistic elegance. Ashokan pillars, crowned with finely carved animal capitals, such as the lion at Sarnath, symbolized both imperial power and moral authority. These pillars often bore inscriptions promoting ethical behavior and served as visible reminders of the emperor's dharma. Monasteries and rest houses were also constructed to support monks and lay travelers, contributing to the development of a trans-regional religious infrastructure. Roads were improved, shade trees planted, and wells dug to facilitate travel and communication. This infrastructural development was not merely utilitarian. It reflected a vision of empire as a moral as well as political space. Despite its achievements, the Maurya Empire began to decline after Ashoka's death. His successors lacked the charisma and ideological commitment to sustain the vast bureaucratic system he had built. Regional governors began to assert autonomy, trade routes faced disruptions, and the empire eventually fragmented into smaller kingdoms. However, the legacy of Ashoka endured. His model of ethical kingship influenced later Indian rulers, Buddhist monarchs in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, and even modern leaders. Mahatma Gandhi, for instance, saw in Ashoka an ideal of nonviolent leadership guided by moral principles. Ashoka's reign also left a profound imprint on Indian political morality. Unlike earlier rulers who legitimized power through divine claims or military conquest, Ashoka presented a new model: the ruler as a servant of the people and a guide to moral living. This idea would reappear in various forms across Indian history in the Bhakti saints, Sufi mystics, and reformist movements, each echoing the belief that spiritual values should guide social and political life. In retrospect, the Maurya Empire was not only India's first great political unification, but also its first attempt to integrate governance with an ethical vision that transcended sectarian boundaries. From Chandragupta's centralization of power to Ashoka's moral revolution, the Mauryas demonstrated that empire could be more than domination. It could be a vehicle for shared values, cultural integration, and the pursuit of a just society. The Mauryan model, despite its eventual decline, set a standard for future Indian empires to measure themselves against, and its ideals continue to inform debates on governance, ethics, and the role of religion in public life even today. Following the decline of the Maurya Empire, the Indian subcontinent entered a transitional period marked by political fragmentation and shifting cultural dynamics. This era, often viewed as an interregnum between the Mauryas and the rise of the classical Gupta period, saw the emergence of the Shunga and Kamva dynasties in northern India. Though short-lived in comparison to the Mauryas, these dynasties played a pivotal role in shaping the religious and cultural contours of the subcontinent, particularly through the revival of Brahmanical traditions and the complex relationship between competing religious ideologies. Pushyamitra Shunga, a general in the Mauryan army, founded the Shunga dynasty after assassinating the last Mauryan ruler. His seizure of power marked not only a political coup, but also a symbolic shift from the Buddhist-leaning policies of Ashoka to a renewed emphasis on Brahmanism. A staunch supporter of orthodox Vedic practices, Pushyamitra reasserted the role of the Brahmins in political and ritual life. He performed Vedic sacrifices such as the Ashvamedha, a royal horse sacrifice that symbolized supreme sovereignty and divine legitimacy. This ritual was as much a statement of political authority as it was a reaffirmation of traditional religious values. It indicated a deliberate attempt to restore the pre-Buddhist religious order that had been partially eclipsed under Ashokan patronage. Accounts from Buddhist sources portray Pushyamitra in a negative light, accusing him of persecuting Buddhists and destroying monasteries. While these reports are debated among historians and likely exaggerated due to sectarian bias, they point to real tensions between Brahmanism and Buddhism during this period. The competition between these two religious traditions was not merely theological, but also institutional. Both sought royal patronage, public support, and influence over education and culture. As a result, temples, monasteries, and sacred texts became arenas of ideological contest. The Shunga period saw a decline in state-supported Buddhist institutions, but Buddhism continued to survive and even flourish in certain regions, particularly in the Northwest and Deccan, supported by local rulers and trade guilds. Despite these conflicts, the period was not characterized by cultural rupture. Instead, there was a remarkable degree of continuity and synthesis. One of the most significant developments during this time was the gradual process of Sanskritization. This term refers to the spread of Sanskrit language, literature, and Brahmanical rituals into wider segments of society. Sanskrit became the preferred medium of elite discourse, legal codes, and poetic expression. While Prakrit remained in use among common people and Buddhist texts, Sanskrit began to reassert its prestige as a sacred and administrative language. This process facilitated the integration of diverse local cultures into a more cohesive religious and linguistic framework centered on Brahmanical norms. Art and architecture also underwent important transformations during the Shunga period. Although imperial patronage of Buddhist stupas diminished, local patrons, particularly merchant guilds, and lay devotees continued to sponsor artistic projects. One notable example is the embellishment of the stupa at Bharhut, which contains intricately carved railings and narrative panels. These artworks, though Buddhist in theme, were often executed by artisans influenced by Brahmanical aesthetics and techniques. This fusion of styles reveals a shared visual culture that transcended religious boundaries and reflected a common vocabulary of sacred imagery. Terracotta figurines, decorative motifs, and temple architecture from this period reveal a transition from the Mauryan style to more regionalized and expressive forms. The representation of yakshas, yakshinis, and other semi-divine beings gained prominence, bridging folk traditions with formal religious art. The emphasis on elaborate ornamentation and dynamic poses suggests an evolving artistic sensibility that laid the groundwork for the more refined expressions of the later Gupta period. Thus, even in the absence of a dominant empire, cultural production remained vibrant and innovative. The Shunga dynasty lasted for several generations, but eventually weakened due to internal strife and external pressures. It was succeeded by the Kanva dynasty, founded by Vasudeva, a minister who overthrew the last Shunga ruler. The Kanvas were Brahmanical in orientation and maintained many of the religious and cultural policies initiated by their predecessors. However, their reign was brief and largely confined to the central Ganges plain. Their rule marked a continuation rather than a dramatic departure from Shunga practices. The Kanvas did not possess the same level of military strength or administrative infrastructure as earlier dynasties, and their political influence declined rapidly. The Kanva period serves as a bridge to the rise of new regional powers and the eventual consolidation of northern India under the Guptas. While politically less significant, the Kanvas contributed to the preservation of Brahmanical traditions during a time of flux. They maintained the intellectual and religious institutions that would later flourish under more stable regimes. Their support for Vedic learning, temple rituals, and priestly authority helped maintain continuity in religious life even as political landscapes shifted. One of the key legacies of both the Shunga and Kanva periods was the establishment of a pattern in which regional rulers aligned themselves with Brahmanical traditions to legitimize their authority. This model would become increasingly common in later Indian history, as kings and dynasties sought to bolster their rule by patronizing Brahmins, conducting Vedic sacrifices, and supporting Sanskrit scholarship. In this way, the ideological framework that had been strengthened during the Shunga and Kanva interregnums became a cornerstone of classical Indian kingship. It is important to recognize that while these dynasties promoted Brahmanism, they did not eradicate other religious traditions. Jainism, Buddhism, and various folk practices continued to exist, adapt, and influence the religious landscape. The interplay between orthodoxy and heterodoxy remained a defining feature of Indian civilization. What distinguishes this period is the gradual re-establishment of Brahmanism not as an exclusive faith, but as a dominant cultural idiom that could accommodate and absorb diverse practices. The Shunga and Kanva interregnums were not merely a time of political decline, but a crucial phase of religious reorientation and cultural consolidation. Through the revival of Vedic rituals, the promotion of Sanskrit, and the continuation of artistic production, these dynasties laid the foundations for the cultural renaissance that would blossom under later empires. The tensions between Buddhism and Brahmanism, far from being destructive, spurred new forms of intellectual and artistic expression. Even as empires rose and fell, the underlying cultural currents remained resilient, continually reshaping the subcontinent's identity. After the fall of the Shunga and Kanva dynasties in northern India, the subcontinent entered a phase marked by the emergence of multiple regional powers and the increasing influence of external forces from Central Asia. One of the most significant and transformative of these forces was the rise of the Kushan Empire, a dynasty of nomadic origin that came to dominate a vast territory stretching from the steppes of Central Asia to the fertile plains of northern India. The Kushan era, beginning around the 1st century of the Common Era, not only brought political unification to a fragmented landscape, but also served as a conduit for far-reaching cultural, religious, and economic exchange. In this dynamic period, Indian civilization found itself at a critical intersection of East and West, where trade routes, belief systems, and artistic styles converged in a vibrant and complex synthesis. The Kushans were originally a branch of the Yuezhi, a Central Asian nomadic group displaced from their homelands near the Chinese frontier. After migrating westward, the Yuezhi settled in Bactria, an area that today lies within northern Afghanistan. From this strategic base, they gradually expanded into the Indian subcontinent under the leadership of Kujala Kadphises, the founder of the Kushan dynasty. He consolidated the fragmented Yuezhi tribes and established the foundation of Kushan rule in northwestern India. His successors, most notably Vima Kadphises and Kanishk, would dramatically expand Kushan power and influence deep into the heart of the Indian subcontinent. The Kushan Empire reached its zenith under Emperor Kanishk, whose reign is often dated to the early 2nd century of the Common Era. Kanishk was not merely a conqueror. He was a visionary ruler whose legacy lies in the cultural and religious pluralism that flourished under his patronage. His empire stretched from the Oxus River in Central Asia to the Gangetic Plains in the east, and from the Kashmir Valley in the north to the Deccan Plateau in the south. Such a vast territory necessitated not only military control, but also an inclusive and adaptive administrative system. The Kushans adopted elements of Persian, Hellenistic, and Indian governance, creating a multicultural bureaucracy that reflected the diversity of their empire. One of the most defining features of the Kushan era was its central role in facilitating long-distance trade. The empire was situated along the ancient Silk Roads that connected China, Central Asia, India, and the Mediterranean world. As merchants traveled these routes bearing goods such as silk, spices, gemstones, and perfumes, they also carried ideas, technologies, and artistic styles. The city of Mathura in northern India became a thriving center of commerce and culture under Kushan rule, while cities like Purishapura, modern-day Peshawar, served as important administrative and religious hubs. The Kushans issued a wide variety of gold, silver, and copper coins, inscribed with multiple languages and scripts, including Greek, Kharosthi, and Brahmi, symbolizing their role as mediators between different civilizations. Religion played a central role in shaping the Kushan worldview and imperial policy. Unlike previous dynasties that privileged a single religious tradition, the Kushans embraced and supported a range of faiths, including Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, Shaivism, and Greek-influenced deities. This religious eclecticism is perhaps best represented by the coinage of the Kushan kings, which often featured images of deities from multiple traditions: Buddha alongside Greek Heracles, Iranian Mitra beside Indian Shiva. This pluralistic representation of divinity reflected the empire's cosmopolitan identity and the pragmatic approach of its rulers toward governance and legitimacy. Kanishk is especially remembered for his patronage of Buddhism, which during his reign entered a new phase of development and dissemination. According to later Buddhist chronicles, Kanishk convened the Fourth Buddhist Council in Kashmir, where scholars gathered to codify texts and refine doctrinal interpretation. This council is said to have played a decisive role in the development of the Mahayana tradition, which emphasized the compassionate ideal of the Bodhisattva and offered a more inclusive spiritual path. Although historical certainty about the council's proceedings is debated, the cultural consequences of Kushan patronage are indisputable. Mahayana Buddhism, under the auspices of the Kushan state, expanded its reach across Central Asia and into East Asia, especially China, where it would become a dominant form of Buddhist practice. In terms of material culture, the Kushan period witnessed remarkable developments in art and architecture, particularly in the schools of Mathura and Gandhara. The Gandhara school, centered in the northwest, combined Hellenistic techniques with Buddhist themes, resulting in sculptures that bore Greco-Roman features: draped robes, realistic musculature, and classical facial profiles while depicting scenes from the life of the Buddha. The Mathura school, on the other hand, retained more indigenous stylistic features but introduced innovative iconography, including the anthropomorphic representation of the Buddha, which became a standard in Buddhist art thereafter. These artistic traditions were not confined to religious objects alone. They also appeared in palace decorations, coin engravings, and public monuments, reflecting a broader cultural transformation. This was also a period of linguistic and literary ferment. Sanskrit began to emerge more prominently as a court and literary language, signaling a shift in elite cultural preferences. While Prakrit remained widely used in inscriptions and popular literature, Sanskrit was increasingly associated with formal learning and high culture. The Kushan rulers issued inscriptions in multiple scripts, showing their responsiveness to diverse linguistic communities across their territories. Moreover, Buddhist texts began to be composed in hybrid Sanskrit, signaling the adaptation of spiritual literature to a changing linguistic landscape. This linguistic evolution set the stage for the efflorescence of Sanskrit literature in the subsequent Gupta period. The Kushan Empire also played a significant role in the spread of Indian ideas beyond its borders. Buddhist missionaries, often sponsored or protected by the Kushan rulers, traveled along the trade routes into Central Asia and China. Monasteries such as those at Bamiyan, Taxila, and Kapisa became centers of learning, where scholars from different lands exchanged ideas and translated texts. The patronage of monumental statues, such as the now-destroyed Bamiyan Buddhas, attests to the scale and ambition of Kushan-era religious art and its role in projecting imperial ideology across a vast and diverse domain. Yet the Kushan Empire was not immune to the pressures of time and circumstance. Internal divisions, economic fluctuations, and external invasions gradually weakened central authority. By the 3rd century of the Common Era, the empire had fragmented into smaller kingdoms. The western territories came under pressure from the Sasanian Empire of Persia, while the eastern regions were gradually absorbed into the growing political constellation that would give rise to the Gupta Empire. Despite the eventual decline of Kushan political power, their cultural and religious legacy endured, influencing the trajectories of Indian, Central Asian, and East Asian civilizations for centuries to come. The Kushan period stands as a testament to the power of cultural fusion, tolerance, and trans-regional exchange. Unlike empires that imposed uniformity, the Kushans thrived by accommodating diversity and promoting connectivity. Their embrace of multiple faiths, their fostering of artistic innovation, and their central role in global trade transformed them into one of the most significant imperial formations of ancient Eurasia. Their era reminds us that political authority, when combined with openness to the world and respect for diversity, can create not only strong states but also enduring civilizations. In this crucible of faith and trade, the Kushans did not merely rule, they forged a bridge between India and the wider world, a bridge whose echoes can still be felt in the religious landscapes, artistic traditions, and cultural exchanges that continue to shape Asia today. Following the gradual decline of the Kushan Empire, the Indian subcontinent saw a resurgence of political unity, economic prosperity, and cultural brilliance under a new imperial power, the Gupta dynasty. Often regarded as a golden age in Indian history, the Gupta period, which spanned from the early 4th century to the mid-6th century of the Common Era, marked a high point in classical Indian civilization. This era witnessed the flourishing of literature, science, art, and religion under the patronage of powerful monarchs who blended political ambition with cultural refinement. While the Guptas did not control the entirety of the Indian subcontinent, their influence radiated far beyond their core territories, leaving a legacy that would shape the contours of Indian identity for centuries. The Gupta dynasty was founded by Sri Gupta, a relatively minor regional chieftain, but it was under Chandragupta I that the empire truly began to rise in prominence. Through a strategic marriage alliance with the powerful Licchavi clan, he laid the groundwork for political consolidation in the Gangetic Plains. His successor, Samudragupta, expanded the empire dramatically through a series of military campaigns that combined conquest with diplomacy. Poets and chroniclers compared him to great conquerors of the past, and his martial exploits were inscribed on the Allahabad Pillar, an Ashokan monument that he repurposed to proclaim his own greatness. These inscriptions depicted a ruler of vast ambition and considerable administrative acumen, who subdued rival kings in the north, demanded tribute from southern rulers, and maintained a network of vassal states that extended the reach of Gupta influence. Yet it was not mere conquest that defined the Gupta legacy. The period was characterized by an extraordinary patronage of the arts and intellectual life. Sanskrit, the classical language of ancient India, flourished as never before, becoming the vehicle for a golden age of literature, philosophy, and scientific thought. Poets such as Kalidasa crafted epic dramas and lyrical poetry that fused courtly sophistication with spiritual depth. Works like Shakuntala, Meghaduta, and Raghavamsha not only entertained royal audiences, but also served as cultural benchmarks for future generations. These compositions were infused with deep philosophical insights, vivid depictions of nature, and a refined aesthetic sensibility that elevated Sanskrit literature to unprecedented heights. Religious life during the Gupta period was marked by a consolidation of Brahmanical Hinduism as the dominant cultural and spiritual force. While earlier centuries had seen significant patronage of Buddhism and Jainism, the Guptas emphasized the Vedic tradition, with particular devotion to Vishnu and Shiva. Temples began to be constructed in greater numbers and with increasing architectural complexity. These stone structures, often adorned with intricate carvings, replaced the earlier wooden shrines and became enduring symbols of the sacred. The Gupta style in temple architecture, characterized by square sanctuaries, curvilinear spires, and elaborately sculpted facades, laid the foundation for later developments in North Indian temple design. Alongside religious art, the period witnessed a remarkable flowering of sculpture and painting. The images of deities created during this era are noted for their graceful proportions, serene expressions, and a sense of spiritual calm that transcends the material world. The seated Buddha statues from Sarnath, with their refined outlines and meditative postures, exemplify this aesthetic. Even as Hinduism gained preeminence, the Guptas continued to support Buddhist institutions, particularly in regions like eastern India, where monasteries such as Nalanda began to rise in prominence as centers of learning and pilgrimage. In addition to artistic and religious developments, the Gupta period was a time of major advances in science and mathematics. Scholars such as Aryabhata revolutionized the field of astronomy by proposing that the Earth rotated on its axis and by calculating the length of the solar year with astonishing precision. His mathematical work introduced the concept of zero as a numeral, a breakthrough that would eventually transform global arithmetic and computing. Other figures, like Varahamihara and Brahmagupta, contributed to knowledge in trigonometry, algebra, and cosmology. Medicine also progressed, with physicians compiling treatises on surgery, pharmacology, and pathology that were studied in universities and medical schools across the subcontinent. The administrative system of the Gupta Empire combined centralized authority with considerable regional autonomy. While the emperor held supreme power, local governance was often left in the hands of feudatory rulers or hereditary administrators. This decentralized model allowed for flexibility and resilience in managing a vast and culturally diverse territory. Land grants to Brahmins and religious institutions were inscribed on copper plates, detailing the rights and privileges bestowed upon the donis. These records, some of which survive to this day, offer valuable insights into the economic, legal, and social structures of the time. Trade and commerce also flourished under Gupta rule. The empire's central position within the subcontinent and its relative political stability encouraged both internal trade and international exchange. Indian merchants traded goods such as cotton, spices, ivory, and gemstones with their counterparts in the Roman Empire, Southeast Asia, and China. Ports on the western coast, such as Badaukh and Sapara, became bustling hubs of maritime activity. The circulation of Gupta coinage, particularly their gold dinars featuring the images of kings performing various rituals or heroic acts, attested to a prosperous and monetized economy. Society during the Gupta period reflected a hierarchical order based on the Varna system, but there was also mobility and diversity within this structure. The position of women, while still constrained by patriarchal norms, allowed for participation in religious rituals and cultural life in some contexts. Literary works often portrayed women as learned, witty, and artistically accomplished, though these representations did not necessarily reflect the lived experience of most women. The caste system became more rigid in some regions, especially as Brahmanical orthodoxy sought to maintain social order, but regional variations continued to exist. One of the most enduring legacies of the Gupta era was the formation of a classical Indian identity that integrated religious devotion, aesthetic expression, philosophical inquiry, and scientific knowledge. This synthesis created a cultural template that would influence subsequent dynasties and transcend political boundaries. Even in later centuries, poets, architects, and philosophers would look back to the Gupta period as an ideal age of harmony and enlightenment. Temples built in later periods often emulated Gupta styles, and kings invoked Gupta lineages to legitimize their own rule. Yet despite its many achievements, the Gupta Empire was not immune to decline. By the 6th century of the Common Era, the empire faced increasing pressure from the northwestern frontiers, where nomadic groups such as the Huns began to penetrate Indian territory. These invasions disrupted trade routes, undermined regional stability, and strained the empire's military resources. While some Gupta rulers mounted effective resistance, the cumulative effect of external attacks and internal fragmentation led to a gradual weakening of imperial authority. Provincial governors and feudatories began asserting their independence, and the once cohesive empire disintegrated into smaller regional kingdoms. The fall of the Gupta Empire did not signify the end of classical Indian culture. Rather, many of the achievements and institutions developed during this period continued to shape Indian society well into the medieval era. The transmission of Buddhist teachings to Southeast Asia and East Asia was accelerated during and after the Gupta period, while the foundations of Hindu philosophy, ritual, and temple architecture remained firmly established. The Sanskrit language continued to serve as a medium of learning and religious expression, and the intellectual traditions initiated by Gupta scholars were preserved in manuscripts and taught in monastic and courtly institutions for generations. In retrospect, the Gupta era was not only a time of political expansion and cultural efflorescence, but also a moment of civilizational self-definition. Through its promotion of a shared cultural idiom based on Sanskrit, its celebration of religious pluralism within a Brahmanical framework, and its encouragement of intellectual and artistic creativity, the Gupta Empire left an imprint on the Indian imagination that endured long after its political decline. It represented a model of imperial greatness that later rulers would aspire to emulate, and its legacy continues to inform the way Indian history is remembered and understood. After the decline of the Gupta Empire in the mid-6th century of the Common Era, the Indian subcontinent entered a period of political fragmentation and regional reconfiguration. Although no single empire managed to restore the subcontinent to the level of unity achieved during Gupta rule, this era was far from stagnant or culturally diminished. On the contrary, it was a time of significant religious transformation, intellectual ferment, and artistic creativity. New regional dynasties rose to power across the landscape, each asserting its legitimacy through unique blends of political governance, temple patronage, and religious alignment. The vacuum left by the fall of centralized authority gave space for powerful expressions of local identity, often shaped around religious devotion, temple cults, and the emerging Bhakti movement. Among the most prominent regional dynasties were the Vakatakas in the Deccan, the Pallavas in Tamil Nadu, and the Chalukyas in Karnataka. In eastern India, the Gaudas and later the Pallas became influential, while in western India, the Maitrakas and Gurjara Pratiharas established strongholds. These dynasties did not operate in isolation. They engaged in warfare, alliances, and trade with one another, creating a dynamic and interconnected political landscape. Each of these regional powers contributed to the broader cultural and religious evolution of India, particularly through their support for temple building, literary production, and philosophical discourse. The rise of devotional Hinduism, often referred to as Bhakti, marked one of the most profound transformations of this era. In contrast to the Vedic emphasis on ritual sacrifice and the monastic discipline of Buddhism and Jainism, Bhakti centered on a deeply personal relationship between the devotee and the divine. This shift was not merely theological. It was also social and cultural, allowing a more inclusive form of worship that could transcend rigid caste hierarchies. The roots of this devotional tradition stretched back to earlier centuries, but in the post-Gupta period, it blossomed into a mass movement that reached into villages, towns, and courts alike. In southern India, the Alvars and Nayanars emerged as the early saints of the Bhakti tradition. The Alvars were devotees of Vishnu, while the Nayanars were worshippers of Shiva. Both groups composed hymns in Tamil that expressed intense love, surrender, and longing for the divine. These hymns were collected in later centuries into canonical texts and recited in temples, public gatherings, and households. Their devotional poetry not only created a direct emotional pathway to the divine, but also elevated the Tamil language as a sacred medium, challenging the Sanskritic monopoly on religious expression. The Bhakti saints often came from diverse social backgrounds, including women and marginalized communities, and they questioned the authority of orthodox Brahmins, emphasizing inner purity over ritual correctness. This rise of regional languages as vehicles for religious and cultural expression was one of the defining features of the post-Gupta era. While Sanskrit continued to flourish in elite and courtly contexts, vernacular languages began to emerge as powerful tools of communication and literary creation. Tamil, Kannada, Marathi, Bengali, and other regional languages developed rich literary traditions, often inspired by devotional themes. Kings and local chieftains sponsored poets and scholars who composed epic narratives, hagiographies, and philosophical treatises in these languages, thus integrating the political and religious life of their regions. Temple architecture during this period achieved new heights of artistic and spiritual expression. Temples were no longer just places of worship. They became the central institutions around which regional identity, economic activity, and political legitimacy coalesced. In the Pallava kingdom, the rock-cut temples of Mahabalipuram represented an extraordinary fusion of engineering and religious art. These structures, carved directly into coastal cliffs, depicted scenes from Hindu mythology with remarkable detail and vitality. The Chalukyas contributed with their unique blend of northern and southern architectural styles, visible in the temple complexes at Badami, Patadakal, and Aihole. These temples were adorned with intricate sculptures of gods, goddesses, dancers, and musicians, revealing a society deeply immersed in both spiritual contemplation and artistic celebration. The religious landscape of this era was not limited to Hinduism alone. Buddhism, although no longer dominant in many parts of northern India, continued to thrive in the east and the Deccan, particularly under the patronage of the Pala dynasty. The Paulas, who ruled parts of Bengal and Bihar from the 8th to the 12th century of the Common Era, were great patrons of Mahayana and later Vajrayana Buddhism. Under their support, great monastic universities such as Nalanda, Vikramashala, and Odantapuri flourished, attracting scholars from as far as China, Tibet, and Southeast Asia. These centers became hubs for the translation of Buddhist texts, the development of complex tantric rituals, and the spread of Indian thought across Asia. Jainism, too, retained a significant presence, particularly in western India and parts of Karnataka. The Chalukyas, Rashtrakutas, and later the Hoslas extended patronage to Jain communities, allowing them to construct magnificent temples and produce philosophical and literary works. Jain art from this period, such as the colossal monolithic statue of Gamachwara at Shravanabelagala, reflected both spiritual idealism and technical mastery. The coexistence of multiple religious traditions during this period, despite occasional conflicts, illustrates the pluralistic character of Indian society and its capacity for dialogical coexistence. The relationship between kingship and religion was a defining element of regional power. Rulers derived legitimacy not only from military conquest or lineage, but also from their alignment with divine forces. Many kings took on titles such as Parama Bhagavata or Mahadevidhiraja, declaring themselves supreme devotees of Vishnu or Shiva. This devotional kingship was often expressed through lavish temple endowments, sponsorship of religious festivals, and the construction of monumental sculptures. Temples were inscribed with records of donations, land grants, and rituals performed by the king, reinforcing the image of the ruler as a protector and servant of Dharma. Land grants played a key role in the political economy of the time. Kings and feudal lords donated land to temples, Brahmins, and monasteries, both as a religious merit-making act and as a means of consolidating political influence. These grants were recorded on copper plates, which have survived as crucial historical sources. They provide insights into agrarian systems, local administration, and social hierarchies. Often, entire villages were assigned to religious institutions, which then acted as centers of economic production, redistribution, and social organization. While political fragmentation characterized the period, there were also moments of imperial ambition and wider territorial control. The Rashtrakutas of the Deccan, for instance, rose to prominence in the 8th century of the Common Era and conducted military campaigns into northern India. Their reign was marked by cultural patronage, including support for both Hindu and Jain institutions. The Chandelas of central India, known for constructing the stunning temples of Khajuraho, also exemplified the integration of royal authority and religious devotion. Their temples, with their erotic sculptures and celestial iconography, illustrated a worldview that saw no contradiction between sensual beauty and spiritual pursuit. Throughout this period, religious pilgrimage became increasingly popular and socially significant. Sacred sites such as Varanasi, Kanchipuram, Puri, and Rameswaram drew devotees from across the subcontinent. These pilgrimages reinforced a sense of shared sacred geography, even in the absence of political unity. Temples often functioned as economic centers, employing artisans, musicians, priests, and administrators. They also served as schools, libraries, and venues for public discourse. The culture of pilgrimage and temple-centered worship tied regional cultures into a broader religious network, facilitating the spread of ideas, practices, and artistic motifs. The era also witnessed the growing importance of devotional music, dance, and theatrical performance. Classical traditions such as Bharatanatyam, Kathak, and Odissi were nurtured in temple environments, where dance was seen as an offering to the divine. Texts like the Natya Shastra provided theoretical frameworks for performance arts, while temple inscriptions recorded the names of court dancers and musicians. These art forms became vehicles for religious expression, emotional resonance, and cultural transmission, linking aesthetics with spirituality. The post-Gupta centuries marked a transition from imperial centralization to regional dynamism, from doctrinal orthodoxy to devotional intimacy. The emergence of Bhakti as a major religious force redefined the relationship between the divine and the individual. Regional powers, though politically fragmented, contributed immensely to the religious and artistic life of India. Through temple architecture, vernacular literature, and devotional performance, they laid the groundwork for a vibrant and pluralistic civilization that would continue to evolve in the coming centuries. The spiritual passion and cultural creativity of this age demonstrated that even in times of political decentralization, the Indian subcontinent could produce a unified sense of meaning through its sacred geography, devotional energies, and shared cultural memory. As the first millennium of the Common Era drew to a close, the Indian subcontinent began to encounter a new wave of political, religious, and cultural currents from beyond its northwestern frontier. These changes were initiated by a series of early Islamic invasions that would eventually give rise to a major political transformation: the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate. This period, spanning from the 8th to the early 16th century, reshaped India's religious and cultural landscape. It did not simply mark the arrival of new rulers, but introduced novel administrative frameworks, architectural forms, and religious interactions that would profoundly influence the subcontinent's future. The earliest contacts between Islam and India occurred through trade rather than conflict. Arab merchants had frequented the Malabar and Gujarat coasts since the 7th century of the Common Era, forging commercial and cultural links with Indian port towns. However, the first major military incursion came with the Arab conquest of Sind in the early 8th century. Led by Muhammad bin Qasim, the Umayyad armies defeated the local ruler Dahir and established Islamic governance over parts of present-day Pakistan. Although this initial occupation was limited in territorial scope, it created lasting channels of exchange between the Islamic world and the Indian subcontinent. For the next few centuries, incursions into northern India were sporadic. It was not until the turn of the 11th century that the invasions became more sustained and systematically organized. Mahmud of Ghazni, a Turkic ruler based in present-day Afghanistan, launched a series of expeditions into India, numbering more than a dozen over a span of nearly 3 decades. His raids targeted wealthy temple towns such as Mathura, Thanesar, and Somnath, and were driven by both religious fervor and the pursuit of economic wealth. These campaigns devastated many centers of Hindu and Buddhist worship, but they also left behind a trail of cultural interaction, including the transmission of Persian administrative practices and the introduction of new artistic motifs. Following Mahmud's campaigns, it was Muhammad of Ghor in the 12th century who laid the groundwork for permanent Islamic rule in northern India. His defeat of the Rajput king Prithviraj Chauhan at the Second Battle of Tarain marked a decisive moment in Indian history. This victory was followed by the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate under his Mamluk general, Qutbuddin Aibak, who declared independence after Muhammad's death. Over the next 3 centuries, Delhi would become the seat of a powerful Islamic polity that ruled over large parts of the Indian subcontinent. The Delhi Sultanate was not a monolithic entity. It comprised several successive dynasties: the Mamluks, Khaljis, Tughlaqs, Sayyids, and Lodis, each bringing its own style of governance, military strategy, and cultural patronage. These rulers faced the challenge of ruling a predominantly non-Muslim population while maintaining their authority in a region of immense linguistic, religious, and ethnic diversity. The sultans employed a combination of military might, administrative innovation, and religious diplomacy to secure their rule. They imported Persian as the court language, introduced Islamic legal institutions such as the Sharia and Qazi courts, and developed systems of taxation and revenue collection that were inspired by Central Asian and Persian models. Despite the initial hostility of many invasions, the Delhi Sultanate period evolved into a complex and multi-layered cultural era. The interaction between Islamic and Indian traditions produced new forms of architecture, literature, music, and philosophy. The construction of the Qutb Minar, begun under Qutbuddin Aibak and completed by Iltutmish, symbolized the arrival of Islamic architecture in India. Made of red sandstone and adorned with Quranic inscriptions, this towering minaret stood adjacent to a mosque built using the remains of Hindu and Jain temples, revealing both the political message and artistic synthesis of the time. The Khalji dynasty, particularly under Alauddin Khalji, expanded the Sultanate's territory deep into the Deccan. Alauddin's military campaigns subdued powerful Hindu kingdoms such as the Yadavas and the Kakatiyas, bringing immense wealth to Delhi. He also instituted price control measures, military reforms, and a sophisticated intelligence network to strengthen central authority. His reign saw both repression and reform, brutality and efficiency, a reflection of the volatile nature of the Delhi Sultanate's early centuries. The Tughlaq dynasty further extended the Sultanate's reach, though with mixed results. Muhammad bin Tughlaq, a ruler of great ambition and intellect, attempted to centralize administration, introduce token currency, and shift the capital from Delhi to Daulatabad. These policies, while visionary, often failed in execution and led to economic disruption and political instability. Yet his reign also demonstrated the Sultanate's aspiration to govern a vast and diverse territory, incorporating different ecological and cultural zones under one imperial framework. Religious life during this period was marked by both conflict and synthesis. There were episodes of temple destruction, forced conversions, and religious persecution, particularly during the reigns of rulers who saw themselves as warriors of the faith. Yet the reality on the ground was often more complex. Many Hindu elites retained local power by cooperating with the Sultanate, and religious life for the masses continued with only gradual changes. Meanwhile, Sufism emerged as a crucial mediating force in Islamic-Hindu relations. Sufi saints such as Khwaja Moinuddin Chishti in Ajmer and Nizamuddin Auliya in Delhi attracted large followings, including Hindus and Muslims alike. Their teachings emphasized love, humility, and the presence of the divine in all beings. Their shrines became sites of interreligious interaction and shared spirituality. The Bhakti movement, which had begun earlier in the south, gained new momentum in northern India during the Sultanate period. Saints like Kabir, Ravidas, and Namdev composed devotional poetry in vernacular languages that transcended sectarian boundaries. They rejected caste hierarchies, criticized religious orthodoxy, and promoted a direct, unmediated relationship with the divine. While some Bhakti poets identified with Hindu deities, others spoke of a formless God beyond all names and images. These voices contributed to a growing spiritual egalitarianism that challenged both Brahmanical authority and rigid Islamic doctrine. Social and economic changes accompanied the religious ferment of this era. Urbanization increased under the Delhi Sultanate, with cities such as Delhi, Multan, and Lahore growing into vibrant centers of trade, administration, and culture. The Sultanate encouraged artisans, weavers, and merchants, many of whom migrated from Central Asia and Persia, bringing with them skills and technologies that enriched local economies. The introduction of new crops, irrigation techniques, and coinage systems transformed agrarian and commercial life. While the peasantry continued to bear heavy burdens, a new urban middle class began to emerge, contributing to a more differentiated social order. Art and literature also flourished during this period, drawing from both Indian and Islamic traditions. The fusion of Persian literary forms with Indian themes gave rise to new genres such as Indo-Persian poetry, historical chronicles, and Sufi literature. Scholars translated Sanskrit texts into Persian and vice versa, creating a vibrant cross-cultural intellectual milieu. Music, too, saw innovation. The legendary musician Amir Khusro, a disciple of Nizamuddin Auliya, composed qawwalis and introduced Persian and Turkish elements into Indian music, laying the foundation for the Hindustani classical tradition. The Delhi Sultanate's legacy was complex. It laid the foundations for Muslim rule in India, introduced new systems of governance, and fostered a rich cultural syncretism. Yet it also witnessed periodic violence, sectarian tensions, and economic strain. By the early 16th century, the Sultanate was weakening under internal divisions and external threats. The Lodi dynasty, the last of the Delhi sultans, struggled to maintain cohesion in the face of rising regional powers and the looming presence of a new force from Central Asia. This final challenge came in the form of Babur, a descendant of Timur and Genghis Khan, who would defeat Ibrahim Lodi at the Battle of Panipat and establish the Mughal Empire. But the Delhi Sultanate, despite its decline, had already transformed the Indian landscape in enduring ways. It had introduced the architecture of domes and arches, the poetry of mystics, and a new model of kingship that combined Islamic authority with Indian reality. Its cities, institutions, and artistic legacies would continue to shape Indian civilization long after the sultans themselves had passed into history. In the early 16th century, the Indian subcontinent underwent another sweeping transformation when Babur, a Central Asian ruler descended from both Timur and Genghis Khan, invaded northern India and established what would become one of the most enduring and culturally influential empires in Indian history, the Mughal Empire. His victory over the Lodi Sultanate at the First Battle of Panipat in the year 1526 marked the beginning of Mughal rule, but it was not merely a change in dynasty. The Mughal era brought a new model of governance, a flowering of Indo-Persian culture, and a sustained effort to synthesize the religious, linguistic, and aesthetic diversity of India into a grand imperial vision. Babur, though a skilled military commander and memoirist, had only begun laying the foundation of the empire when his untimely death in the year 1530 placed the burden of consolidation on his son, Humayun. Humayun's reign was marked by internal instability and fierce resistance from rival powers, especially the formidable Afghan leader Sher Shah Suri. Humayun lost his kingdom and spent years in exile, only returning with Persian assistance to reclaim Delhi shortly before his death. Although his rule was brief and tumultuous, Humayun established critical cultural links with Persia that would profoundly influence Mughal court aesthetics and administration. It was Humayun's son, Akbar, who truly transformed the fledgling dynasty into a formidable empire. Ascending the throne as a teenager in the year 1556, Akbar expanded Mughal territory through a combination of military conquest, strategic alliances, and a novel policy of religious tolerance. He defeated the Rajput confederacies, integrated regional chieftains into his court, and laid the foundations of a centralized administrative system based on merit rather than lineage. One of his most enduring innovations was the creation of the Mansabdari system, which graded nobles according to rank and military obligation, ensuring both loyalty and effective governance. This system provided the Mughals with a standing bureaucracy and army, capable of managing an increasingly vast and diverse empire. Akbar's approach to religion was revolutionary. Deeply curious and intellectually adventurous, he invited scholars, theologians, and mystics from various faiths to his court. In his Ibadat Khana, or house of worship, he hosted debates between Muslims, Hindus, Christians, Jains, and Zoroastrians. His effort to reconcile religious differences culminated in the formulation of the Din-i-Ilahi, or the religion of God, a syncretic faith that emphasized ethical conduct, universal tolerance, and reverence for a divine force beyond formal dogma. Though the Din-i-Ilahi never gained mass following, it symbolized Akbar's vision of an inclusive empire rooted in moral unity rather than sectarian supremacy. Under Akbar's reign, the Mughal court became a magnet for artists, poets, musicians, and scholars from across the Islamic world and the Indian subcontinent. Persian became the language of administration and high culture, but regional languages were not neglected. Akbar commissioned translations of Hindu epics like the Mahabharata and Ramayana into Persian, and he supported the production of illustrated manuscripts that fused Indian and Persian artistic styles. The Mughal miniature painting tradition reached new heights during his rule, blending vivid Indian color palettes with Persian detailing and composition. Akbar's court painters, such as Baisawan and Abd al-Samad, helped define an imperial aesthetic that celebrated the diversity of Indian life while affirming the grandeur of Mughal rule. His successor, Jahangir, inherited a stable and prosperous empire in the early 17th century. Though not as politically dynamic as Akbar, Jahangir was an astute administrator and a passionate patron of the arts. His court diaries, known as the Tuzka-Jahangiri, reflect his deep interest in nature, justice, and artistic refinement. Under Jahangir, Mughal portraiture reached unparalleled levels of detail and realism. Artists like Bichitra and Mansur created paintings that meticulously captured both royal likenesses and flora and fauna. Jahangir's love of gardens, symmetry, and ordered design extended the Mughal vision of aesthetic and natural harmony. Jahangir's queen, Nur Jahan, was an exceptionally influential figure, wielding political power and directing many imperial decisions. Her patronage extended to architecture, textiles, and the refinement of courtly etiquette. She also issued royal orders in her own name, an extraordinary feat for a Mughal woman, which testifies to the sophistication and flexibility of Mughal court politics. Her legacy continued in the next reign under her stepson, Shah Jahan, whose rule is often considered the zenith of Mughal architecture and imperial pomp. Shah Jahan's reign in the mid-17th century was marked by monumental constructions that embodied the empire's wealth, artistic ambition, and spiritual grandeur. The Taj Mahal, built in memory of his beloved wife Mumtaz Mahal, stands as an enduring testament to Mughal architectural excellence. Blending Persian, Indian, and Islamic design principles, the structure is not only a mausoleum, but a poetic statement of eternal love and divine beauty. During his rule, Shah Jahan also rebuilt parts of Delhi, constructing the Red Fort and the Jama Masjid, thereby transforming the city into a center of imperial spectacle and urban sophistication. His reign saw the perfection of the Mughal style, characterized by domes, minarets, calligraphy, floral motifs, and geometric balance. However, the immense expenditures on architecture and courtly life strained the empire's finances, which became more apparent under the rule of his son Aurangzeb. Aurangzeb, who ascended the throne after a brutal war of succession, adopted a markedly different vision of kingship. A devout and orthodox Sunni Muslim, he rolled back many of the policies of religious tolerance established by Akbar and reimposed the jizya, a tax on non-Muslims. His enforcement of Islamic law alienated many Hindu nobles and regional powers, weakening the delicate balance of loyalty that his predecessors had so carefully cultivated. Though Aurangzeb expanded the empire to its greatest territorial extent, stretching from Kashmir in the north to Tamil Nadu in the south, the very scale of this expansion made the empire harder to govern. Constant warfare in the Deccan drained the treasury, while rebellions by the Marathas, Sikhs, and Rajputs exposed the limits of Mughal central authority. His reign, while politically formidable, sowed the seeds of imperial fragmentation. The spiritual and cultural synthesis that had defined the Mughal ethos began to unravel under the weight of sectarian rigidity and military overreach. Nevertheless, even during these later years, Mughal culture continued to flourish in regional centers. Music, literature, and painting were practiced and refined in provincial courts that emulated imperial models. The Urdu language began to emerge during this time as a hybrid of Persian, Arabic, and Indian vernaculars, eventually developing into a rich literary medium. Poets like Wali Dakhani and later Mir Taqi Mir helped shape its poetic canon, while Indo-Islamic musical traditions such as Qawwali, Khyal, and Thumri continued to evolve. Throughout the Mughal era, trade and commerce reached new heights. India became a crucial node in global networks of exchange, exporting textiles, spices, indigo, and gemstones to the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Europe. The empire maintained diplomatic relations with the Safavids in Persia, the Ottomans in the West, and the Ming and Qing courts in China. Mughal ports such as Surat, Masulipatam, and Hooghly became bustling centers of international commerce. European traders Portuguese, Dutch, French, and especially the English established coastal trading posts and negotiated with Mughal officials to access lucrative markets. The English East India Company, founded in the year 1600, would eventually exploit this commercial foothold for imperial ambitions of its own. Despite the growing presence of foreign traders and the internal challenges of Aurangzeb's rule, the Mughal court remained a beacon of refinement and sophistication. Its rituals, clothing, literature, and etiquette set standards that would influence South Asian culture for centuries. Even after the empire began to weaken in the 18th century, its legacy endured in successor states, regional courts, and popular imagination. The memory of the Mughal Golden Age, marked by balance, tolerance, and grandeur, remained alive in the works of historians, poets, and artists long after its political power had faded. By the early 18th century, after Aurangzeb's death, the empire fragmented rapidly under the pressures of provincial revolts, fiscal exhaustion, and the rise of new powers such as the Marathas, the Sikhs, and later the British. Yet the Mughals, even in decline, retained symbolic authority. The imperial throne in Delhi continued to represent the ideal of centralized, just, and cultured governance, even as real power slipped into the hands of other players. When the British East India Company eventually seized Delhi in the 19th century, they did so not only through superior arms, but also by appropriating the legitimacy of the Mughal name. The Mughal Empire, over the course of nearly 2 centuries, managed to create a political and cultural synthesis that few other empires in Indian history have matched. Its rulers governed not merely through conquest, but through an understanding of India's religious diversity, its aesthetic traditions, and its regional complexities. They built cities, gardens, and institutions that reflected a vision of ordered harmony. They supported languages, arts, and faiths that bridged the gap between Persian elegance and Indian vitality. And they cultivated an image of kingship that aspired to be both just and divinely sanctioned. In the sacred geography of India, the Mughals constructed new spiritual centers while preserving older ones. They did not erase what came before. They layered it with their own meanings, contributing to the pluralistic and palimpsestic character of Indian civilization. Though their empire eventually fell to colonial and regional forces, the cultural memory of their reign shaped by beauty, tolerance, and ambition remains embedded in the collective consciousness of South Asia to this day. The story of India's dynastic past is not confined to ancient chronicles or the ruins of palaces. It breathes in temples and mosques, in languages spoken across states, in festivals that mix devotion and drama, and in the layered ways people live, worship, and remember. The empires that ruled the subcontinent from the Mauryas and Guptas to the Delhi Sultans and the Mughals shaped more than territory. They shaped India's soul, inscribing their religious choices, artistic visions, and political ideologies into the very grain of Indian civilization. As India moved into the modern era, the echoes of these dynasties did not vanish. Instead, they continued to guide, complicate, and sometimes challenge the making of a new national identity. The memory of Ashoka, the Mauryan emperor who turned to Buddhism after the violence of the Kalinga War, has endured as a symbol of ethical governance. In the middle of the 20th century, when India achieved independence from British colonial rule, Ashoka's lions were adopted as the emblem of the Indian state. His chakra, the wheel of Dharma, became the central motif of the national flag. This was not merely a gesture to antiquity, but a deliberate invocation of a ruler who embraced nonviolence, compassion, and moral responsibility as the foundations of statecraft. Ashoka's edicts, inscribed on rocks and pillars 2 millennia earlier, were seen as early models of public communication and ethical leadership in a diverse society. Similarly, the Gupta period, often regarded as a classical golden age of Hindu art and science, helped inform the modern idea of Indian cultural identity. The Sanskrit epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, which were consolidated and popularized during this era, continued to be retold in every corner of the country, both in regional languages and through performance traditions. Television serials in the late 20th century brought these epics into millions of homes, turning ancient myths into shared national experiences. This process deepened a sense of cultural unity while also highlighting regional variations in the telling of these stories. The Bhakti movement, which spanned centuries and crossed dynasties, laid a foundation for vernacular religious expression that still thrives in modern India. Saints such as Kabir, Mirabai, and Tukaram rejected ritualism and caste, emphasizing love and surrender to the divine. Their songs and poems continue to be sung by devotional communities, performed on stages, and quoted in political speeches. They offer a language of spirituality that is accessible and democratic, challenging orthodoxy while deepening emotional bonds with the sacred. The Bhakti tradition shaped Indian secularism in a unique way, not by rejecting religion, but by drawing on a legacy of inclusive and pluralistic devotion. The Sufi orders, particularly the Chishti and Qadiri saints who flourished during the Delhi Sultanate and Mughal periods, remain spiritual beacons to many. Their dargahs, such as those of Moinuddin Chishti in Ajmer or Nizamuddin Auliya in Delhi, attract pilgrims across religious boundaries. In modern times, these sites have become symbols of syncretic heritage, places where Hindu and Muslim, rich and poor, urban and rural devotees gather in search of blessings and healing. Sufi music, especially Qawwali, has become a powerful cultural expression that transcends religion. Its poetic themes of divine love, human suffering, and mystical union continue to inspire musicians and audiences in both South Asia and the diaspora. One of the most visible and lasting contributions of India's dynastic past is in architecture. Cities such as Delhi, Agra, Hyderabad, and Jaipur were their histories in stone and marble. The forts and palaces of the Rajputs, the domed mosques of the sultans, and the tombs and gardens of the Mughals are not only tourist attractions, they are emblems of India's architectural dialogue between Islamic, Hindu, Persian, and Central Asian styles. The Taj Mahal, for instance, remains a symbol of India in the global imagination. But it is also a living reminder of a time when beauty was built to reflect eternity, love was memorialized in geometry, and artisanship was a vehicle of empire and piety alike. Language, too, carries dynastic legacies. Sanskrit, once the language of royal courts and sacred scriptures, became the root of many modern Indian languages and the subject of revivalist efforts in the nationalist period. Persian, introduced by the Delhi Sultans and refined by the Mughals, influenced the development of Urdu, which emerged as a courtly language during the late Mughal period and grew into a vibrant medium of poetry, prose, and music. In modern India and Pakistan, Urdu and Hindi share vocabulary and syntax, even as they diverge in script and cultural affiliation. These linguistic continuities and tensions reflect centuries of coexistence and competition between dynastic traditions and vernacular realities. The modern Indian state has inherited and reinterpreted these historical strands in its constitutional values, educational narratives, and public commemorations. Secularism in India, unlike in the West, is not simply the separation of religion from the state. It is a delicate balancing act among multiple religious traditions that have deep historical roots. The idea of India as a composite culture, celebrated by thinkers such as Jawaharlal Nehru, draws heavily on the experience of dynasties that ruled over plural societies. The concept of unity in diversity, often invoked in political discourse, finds precedent in the ways emperors like Akbar sought to accommodate competing faiths under a single imperial umbrella. Yet the legacies of dynastic religion and culture have not always been sources of harmony. In modern times, these memories have been mobilized for divisive purposes. The destruction of the Babri Masjid in Ayodhya in the year 1992 and the subsequent communal violence brought historical grievances to the fore. The mosque, believed by some to have been built on the birthplace of the Hindu god Ram, became a flashpoint for debates over history, identity, and nationhood. The controversy was not merely about a 16th-century structure, but about how India's dynastic past should be remembered and who gets to claim it. Textbooks and monuments have become battlegrounds of interpretation. Some seek to celebrate India's Hindu heritage while minimizing the contributions of Muslim dynasties, while others emphasize the shared achievements of all communities. These tensions reflect broader political and social currents, but also reveal the powerful emotional charge of historical memory in contemporary India. The question of what it means to be Indian is often answered through the lens of the past, where dynasties are invoked not only as rulers, but as symbols of civilization, pride, or grievance. In popular culture, dynastic themes remain deeply embedded. Historical films, television series, and novels often depict the lives of emperors and saints, warriors and poets. From Bollywood epics to regional folklore, the grandeur of the Mauryas, the mysticism of the Bhakti saints, the romance of Mughal courts, and the resistance of Rajput queens are reimagined and retold for new generations. These portrayals sometimes simplify or mythologize complex histories, but they also keep the memory of India's dynastic tapestry alive in public consciousness. The physical landscape continues to be marked by dynastic religious legacies. Temple towns like Varanasi, Madurai, and Puri still host rituals whose origins stretch back to ancient dynasties. Mosques built during the Sultanate and Mughal periods remain active places of worship. Churches, synagogues, and gurudwaras established in pre-modern times continue to serve their communities. The coexistence of these structures speaks to the layered nature of Indian religiosity, where the sacred is often shared, adjacent, or intertwined. Even India's federal structure reflects historical continuities. The diversity of states, languages, and customs echoes the patchwork of dynastic rule that existed before colonial unification. Regional pride and heritage, whether Maratha, Tamil, Assamese, or Bengali, draws strength from historical kingdoms and cultural legacies that predate the modern nation-state. This decentralization of memory and identity is both a challenge and a resource for contemporary India. The legacy of dynastic religion and culture in India is thus not a static inheritance, but a living, contested, and evolving force. It offers models of coexistence, as well as episodes of conflict, artistic brilliance alongside political repression, spiritual insight alongside worldly ambition. From Ashoka's moral empire to Akbar's syncretic vision, from the Bhakti poets' cries for love to the Sufi saints' calls for transcendence, from temple rituals to Mughal domes, the dynastic past offers both continuity and critique. As India faces the 21st century, with its rapid urbanization, technological change, and global interconnectedness, the wisdom and wounds of its dynastic history continue to shape how it understands itself. These legacies call for a deeper engagement, not only to preserve monuments or celebrate achievements, but to reflect on the values that made pluralism possible and on the costs when it failed. In doing so, India reaffirms not a single narrative, but a mosaic of civilizations that grew along the banks of sacred rivers, under the watch of kings and saints, in temples and mosques, in poems and prayers. This enduring legacy is not confined to India alone. Across South Asia and Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, the echoes of dynastic culture remain audible in language, ritual, music, and memory. Whether through shared epics, Sufi poetry, or architectural heritage, the subcontinent continues to live with and through its dynastic past. It is a past that invites not nostalgia, but reflection a reminder that religion and culture, when intertwined with power, can divide or unite, oppress or liberate, diminish or exalt. How modern India interprets and lives with this legacy will shape its future as much as its past. India's history is not merely a story of rulers and wars, but a profound narrative of how religion and culture were shaped, elevated, and transformed by dynasties that rose and fell along its sacred rivers. From the earliest empires to the twilight of the Mughals, dynastic rule in India was inseparable from spiritual expression and cultural innovation. The subcontinent's imperial legacy is a tapestry woven with strands of conquest and compassion, sacred architecture and philosophical insight, ritual traditions and social reform. Each dynasty, in its own way, contributed to the religious pluralism and cultural richness that define the Indian experience. Beginning with the Mauryas, the earliest empire to unify much of the Indian subcontinent under a centralized administration, we see how power and piety coexisted. Chandragupta Maurya's political centralization laid the groundwork for a vast empire, but it was Ashoka's embrace of Buddhism and moral governance that left a deeper civilizational imprint. His rock and pillar edicts, carved into the Indian landscape, broadcast values of compassion, tolerance, and nonviolence. These values, rooted in the Buddhist principle of Dharma, became not just religious ideals but guiding norms of kingship, influencing both contemporary and future rulers. Ashoka's transformation from a conqueror to a moral exemplar marked one of the earliest and most influential episodes of religious state synergy. As the Maurya Empire gave way to the Shungas and Kanvas, there emerged new tensions between Brahmanism and Buddhism, reflecting deeper cultural shifts. Yet even during these interregnums, the religious conversation continued through Sanskritization and the patronage of early Hindu deities. With the rise of the Gupta Empire, India entered an era often considered a classical golden age. The Guptas not only revived Vedic traditions but also fostered literature, astronomy, and sculpture. Hinduism took on more recognizable and enduring forms, while the epics, Puranas, and devotional cults helped institutionalize a religious culture that was both local and expansive. The medieval period saw the emergence of powerful regional dynasties like the Chalukyas, Pallavas, Cholas, and Rashtrakutas in the south, and the Rajputs in the north. These kingdoms built grand temples and developed sophisticated philosophical schools. The temples were more than places of worship, they were centers of art, education, and economic activity. This period also witnessed the flowering of devotional movements, with saints preaching in regional languages and emphasizing direct connection with the divine, often challenging caste hierarchies and orthodox rituals. Religion thus became more democratized and rooted in local cultures, blending the elite with the popular, the scriptural with the emotional. The advent of the Delhi Sultanate brought new religious traditions and social patterns to the Indian landscape. Islam, which arrived earlier through traders and Sufi saints, now gained political authority. The sultans introduced Persian art and architecture, established madrasas, and built mosques across urban centers. Yet even as Islamic governance expanded, cultural exchange with Hindu subjects remained constant. Sufi mysticism, which emphasized personal experience of the divine, found resonance with the local population, mirroring the Bhakti emphasis on love and surrender. This mutuality gave rise to shared spaces of devotion and composite traditions that blurred strict religious divides. The Mughal Empire carried these exchanges further, building a truly syncretic vision of India under emperors like Akbar. Akbar's policy of Sul-e-Kul, or universal tolerance, and his interest in religious dialogue, remain some of the most remarkable attempts at interfaith understanding in world history. Under his rule and that of his successors, the subcontinent saw the construction of architectural marvels, the compilation of histories, the flourishing of Urdu poetry, and the formation of an Indo-Persian cultural identity. While religious tensions existed and were sometimes exploited, the general ethos was one of coexistence and shared cultural expression. The Mughal court became a melting pot where Hindu and Muslim intellectuals, artists, and mystics contributed to a vision of empire as a pluralistic space. Religion under these dynasties was never simply a personal matter, it was deeply political. Rulers used religion to legitimize their power, unify their domains, and project moral authority. Temples and mosques were built not only as houses of worship, but as declarations of sovereignty. Pilgrimage routes were secured and expanded to reinforce territorial claims. Rituals were standardized, festivals institutionalized, and texts canonized. At the same time, spiritual movements, whether monastic or mystical, Bhakti or Sufi, often challenged royal authority or provided alternative social and moral visions. This tension between sacred and sovereign forces enriched India's religious landscape, making it more dynamic and layered. The legacy of these dynasties survives not only in monuments and manuscripts, but in the way modern India negotiates its identity. The use of Ashoka's symbols in the national emblem, the continued popularity of epics shaped by the Guptas, the enduring appeal of Sufi and Bhakti poetry, and the architectural pride taken in Mughal monuments all attest to a civilization still in conversation with its dynastic past. These memories are not always consensual, interpretations vary, and historical wounds remain, but they continue to shape India's public life, educational frameworks, and national imagination. However, the role of dynasties in shaping religion and culture also carries warnings. There were times when faith was used to justify exclusion, conquest, or orthodoxy. Religious patronage could reinforce caste hierarchies or marginalize dissenting sections. The destruction of temples or the imposition of new faiths could lead to trauma and resentment. These darker aspects of dynastic religious policy remind us that the intertwining of religion and power is always a double-edged sword. The grandeur of empires must be balanced with the experiences of those who were silenced or displaced. In the 21st century, as India confronts questions of secularism, identity politics, and cultural preservation, the lessons of its dynastic past are more relevant than ever. The ability of rulers to accommodate diversity, the flourishing of religious and artistic creativity, and the efforts to create inclusive spiritual communities all offer inspiration. At the same time, the dangers of religious authoritarianism, cultural exclusivism, and historical revisionism remain cautionary tales. Ultimately, the empires of India's sacred rivers did not simply pass on temples or texts. They passed on ways of thinking, worshipping, debating, and imagining the divine. They left behind not a singular faith, but a kaleidoscope of religious expressions. This multiplicity, nurtured over centuries, is both India's inheritance and its challenge. To honor this legacy is not only to preserve what was built, but to live out its deeper ethos, an ethos of dialogue, tolerance, creativity, and spiritual depth. The story of India from the Mauryas to the Mughals is thus not just a chronicle of past glories. It is a mirror held up to the present, reflecting how religion and culture, when embraced with humility and imagination, can transcend the limits of time and empire.